The pan breathed out a wet sweetness, and the night took it back. A ladle paused mid-arc, as if it had remembered a name it could not say. A door settled. Iron learned patience. The stirpole's shadow wrote a line across the vat and would not move. The candle leaned, and ordinary things began to keep the count. Before we step inside this story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and what is the time there right now, because we want to know how fast our story has to reach you. Steam laid its hand on the damp boards, and the boards accepted the weight. Syrup foamed to a skin and drew back, ashamed of the boil it could not hide. The skimming ladle rang the rim with a small iron vowel and rested. The latch at the pan-house door settled its tongue into the strike and behaved like a servant who has learned to listen. There is a silence that presses. It adds. It does not explain. The mill groaned at its harness. The horse took another circle, as if time were a ring one could wear to keep from forgetting. Sweet green juice ran like glass into shallow pans and learned heat in sections, traveling from raw to finished the way a man travels from one name to another and pretends he has always been both. The candle guttered, bowed, then stood straight. Fire does not scream, it claims. The big house had its paneled dusk. The quarters near the press had their lamp oil haze. Between them, the yard held the ledger of footprints and drips, a book the rain edits and the sun re-inks. Windows kept their fog because breath had instructed them in secrecy. Iron in hinges, iron in hooks, iron in the horse's bit. Metal learned a choir part and sang low under the steam. The ground remembers. Cold gnawed at wet planks until the grain rose like a rash under the hand. A horse-powered mill creaked around its tired grammar, the sweep tracing a circle that made time agree to behave. Juice ran bright from crushed cane, a green that looked like glass taught to move. It slid through gutters into evaporator pans, where heat divided the world into sections. Raw, learning, ready. The breath of it made the rafters sweat, and the men too. The big house kept its paneled dusk and the smell of wax that tells you nothing. The quarters near the press kept the smell of lamp oil, damp cloth, and the iron tang of work. Whitewash lifted in thin moons where steam had licked it for a season. Doors swelled, hinges voiced their opinions, and latches learned compromise. Wheels scarred clay in parallel lines that remembered storms better than sermons. Windows wore fog in the mornings, like a veil one does not remove for company. Inside a small office near the pan house, a ledger sat beside a box of skimmers and hooks, as if numbers and tools were cousins. Ink bled where a cold night found the paper thin. The quill scratched its small convictions into the page. Ounces, hours, fines, tasting permissions. The moral economy was measured by scoops and the distance between a hand and a vat without being seen. A pewter dipper rang the rim of a bucket, and the sound traveled along the boards like a message that did not wish to be read. The mill had its own heartbeat. Harness leather ticked. The sweep sighed. Cane fed itself to iron rollers, and the rollers answered with a hymn that was not praise. The evaporator held its divided patience, letting sweetness learn itself by inches. Beniah's breath clouded and dissolved in the steam. He knew the pan house light by color, the thin blue when dampers were right, the orange warning when a corner begged for attention. The ground took spilled juice and made it disappear into a stickiness that remembered everyone. Wheel ruts kept their damp, and men stepped where men had stepped, not from laziness, but from an agreement with clay. In the nights the fog held low, and the horse's flank steamed in the lantern's circle. The candle at the sill guttered when the latch kissed home, and then forgave the latch for being honest. A boy watched from the dark and learned the names of tools by the way their shadows lay. Skimmer, hook, stirpole, dipper. Names matter. They are the first counting and the last. The ground remembers. Beniah tended fireboxes and foam the way a man tends a difficult child, firm, quiet, unwilling to be fooled by pretty promises. His wrist held steady when a boil chose to climb. His eye caught the color that means almost and the color that means now. The vats breathed and he could hear them, each section with its own lungs. Stillness read as absence to those who needed it to. To the work, it read as law. A mother struck for skimmings, not theft, the overseer said, correction. He learned the tone of Cain against flesh that makes a hymn out of pain and vowed to end the music. A brother marched at dusk, the road forgetting his name before the lamp at the quarters forgot his breath. Beniah folded these into a kerchief and put the cloth where breath could press it warm. It was not hope. It was a ledger the page would not keep. Cloth rasped on wood when he shouldered a board, a sound like a saw beneath a blanket. He walked thresholds with a quiet foot, so the threshold would remember the courtesy and return it later. He counted in breaths between boils, in steps from firebox to vat lip. In the length a candle loses while a section learns readiness. Numbers tasted like iron under the tongue. He kept them there until the mouth of the night was willing to hear. His eyes carried resolve without asking to be seen. He moved in the steam's grammar and did not invite applause. A skimming ladle rang the pan, and the ring told him more than a man's talk could. Dull meant the foam had lied about its thickness. Bright meant the boil had agreed to quiet down. He learned hinges by touch, the one that resented weather, the one that loved attention, the one that believed in him. Doors that are watched behave. He watched without making a show of it. The overseer's cane tapped. Lessons into boards, into backs, into the air itself. A metronome for obedience dressed as improvement. Beniah heard the frequency and wrote it down inside, where hands cannot tear pages. In the office, the ledger wrote a different music. Ounces shaved thin, hours revised, tastes denied. Between cane and ink, a man learns his weight in two currencies. One buys hunger, the other buys silence. He refused both, but refusal is an art that likes practice. By the pans, breath measured what paper refused to keep. If he looked at the vat's skin long enough, it showed him men's faces in the bubbles and told him the truth of their names. He did not tell anyone. The pan house keeps its own confessions. He kept the count. He waited for the hour that would deserve the number he was saving. The ground remembers. The overseer made sugar work a liturgy. Cane taps were commandments. Shaved measures were penitence. Punishments dressed as corrections wore a polite coat and carried a blade underneath. Tasting was rationed and weaponized. Permission a lesson, denial a sermon. The ledger sat near the pan house so arithmetic could smell steam. Piety, meanwhile, dressed itself in parlor air and said grace over a table of obedience. Both sharpened the same blade. Scoop on syrup, quill scratch, cane tap, tobacco breath in steam. Hush held tight so the boil could be heard obeying. A man who asked for sweetness learned that sweet can be an instrument of power, its edge as clean as any iron. The overseer tapped a rhythm into the boards that Beniah converted to nights. Nights answered, with a music the cane had not learned yet. Beniah's wrist stayed steady. The skimmer moved like a clock that refused lies. He saw the way the ledger stroked one name and scolded another, and he kept those strokes in a second book. Breath and step, and the number of times a door tried to stick before it yielded. Order at table was a show that required spectators. Order in dirt was a practice that trained iron. He learned which order deserved his hands. Steam drew water out of men and made their lips salt. A frown can taste like brine when it stays too long. The office ink bled at the corner of a page, and the clerk blotted it into a bruise, pretending accidents are innocent. The moral economy measured bodies by access to sweet, by hours of heat, by the distance between a mouth and a ladle. Beniah tasted the air and found it instructed him to wait. Fire does not scream, it claims. The fireboxes claimed wood and gave back this boiled concentration. Sugar's dark hymn. In that hymn, a note began to sound under the others, a note made of names kept warm under a tongue, of hinges stroked into friendship, of latches that preferred to be asked instead of told. He heard it. He did not rush it. The ground remembers. The fire popped with no wind, a clean crack that startled the boil, and then apologized by quieting too fast. The lantern huffed a blind breath against its glass and went milky from the inside. Foam refused to clear on a perfect boil, holding a dull skin as if it had decided to keep a secret. A dog at the door pricked once toward the vat, and then tucked its sound away like contraband. The rafters sweated without heat. There is a silence that presses. It adds. It does not explain. A ration slip, damp at the corner, smeared into a thumbprint where a name had been, a man traded to weather by paper that preferred clean margins. A hinge in the mill loft tried a low complain and then learned discretion. Burnt sugar note rose and flattened, hovering where sweetness ends and warning begins. In the cabins, a child's couplet learned its feet, count the names, keep the heat, and no adult corrected the melody. Rumor walked between firebox and door, a sour well at dawn, a cedar shaving bound in red thread at a sill, a miscount that fixed itself. None of this was proof. All of it was weight. Beniah listened. Lantern sputter, hinge moan, ration slip smudge, burnt sugar timing, whispers like cloth. He laid each in the body's balance pan and felt the tilt. Steam wrote on his face and then erased itself. The ladle's ring went from bright to dull and back, as if practicing two truths. The mill's groan drifted lower with the cold and taught his chest a rhythm that could walk in the dark without stumbling. Doors that are watched behave. He watched the doors and let them think he was thinking of something else. The ground remembers even when steam chooses to forget. Sweetness turned quarrelsome in their mouths. Bread asked work of the jaw it had never asked before. They sat, spoons in hand, and the bowl made an argument the hand declined to hear. Cramps braided rope through the middle, pulling forward when a man tried to lie on his back and pulling back when he tried his side. He called it weather, then season, then a fatigue that felt like someone had moved his name to a shelf too high to reach. The doctor arrived with bottles and certainty. He opened his case like a deacon opens doctrine and found the same comfort there. Bilious humors, the need to bleed a body that had grown proud, calomel to instruct the gut in humility, bitters to strengthen a tongue that had grown ungrateful. He drew a vein and called it remedy. He measured chalk and mercury like a clerk weighs faith. Remedies thinned them. Symptoms refused to confess. Cloths held at lips came away with ordinary stains, the kind that frighten because they look like life forgetting to continue. Lamps guttered and tried again, as if rehearsing steadfastness. The office ledger learned new shyness, where rations altered and where tastes contracted. A line that once doubled wages for press days wore a blot that spread until it resembled a small weather front. Safer to erase than to know. The overseer's cane made smaller maps on the plank floor, borders drawn as if geography could be blamed for men's faces losing their color. The horse at the mill wore its steam, like a shawl, and worked without complaint, which is a horse's way of indicting men. He tried the sweet that is not rationed, the kind from a private jar that remembers summers, and his tongue refused and punished him in the same breath. He slept and woke as if a hand were shaking him gently by the ribs and asking for something he could not give. The doctor spoke in a grammar that folded pain into terms polite enough to put at table. He left with his fee. The bottles remained to supervise the night. The window filmed over where breath had tested it. The key ring on the wall made no sound at all. The ground remembers what medicine cannot read. Moonless meant the mill's slow cadence could be heard farther. The horse's leather tick set the measures the frogs could not keep in cold. Threshold night gathered itself along sill and latch. Hinges learned they were being watched and improved their manners. Stillness took off its coat and began to work. He gathered tokens that could pass for tools if spoken to harshly. A spare latch pin, whose absence had been forgiven months ago. A coil of wire that remembered the voice of a hasp. A cedar chip with the breath of clean rooms and patient boxes. Knotted twine left with ends uneven, so the knot would remember why it existed. A slotted skimmer, nicked on its lip like a letter. A dull hook with the right kind of curve to move what should not be lifted by a hand. Iron pin weight, wire scrape, cedar scent, twine knot, damp floor line, each a word in a grammar the panhouse understood. Counting steps from firebox to vat lip is a sacred arithmetic of this place. 3 if you are only looking. 4 if you mean to work. 5 if the heat has something to teach you tonight. From damper to brace. 2 if the wood is dry. 3 if the wood has memory. From latch to sill line. 1 if the door respects you. 1 again if you agree to respect the door. The mill groaned lower. The hour obliged like a mule that hates the harness and still pulls. He spoke to the iron with the back of his knuckles. He asked the damper to consider discretion. He taught the wedge how to sit so its knock would pass for fruit falling on the far side of the press shed. He let the skimmer's nick line up with a seam that did not exist before he believed in it. Wire rehearsed the hasp's dialect and learned to answer in a key half lower than memory. The cedar chip sat in a corner and kept witness, which is different from keeping watch. Doors behaved because they had been given the chance to. Hinges answered softly because noise had not been invited. Steam hung back as if a curtain had been pulled, and it preferred to see how the scene would play before committing applause. Names gathered behind his teeth and agreed to be counted only in breath, because breath leaves less handwriting than sound. The damp floor line at the sill remembered feet and consented to another. The ground remembers, even when boards decide to forget. Vents were dampered and then asked to hold. Heat learned to stay home. A brace met a beam and agreed on a pressure that could pass for fatigue if a careless eye should find it. A wedge took its lesson and wore quiet like a Sunday coat. Weight arranged itself as if the night had always intended this and had simply been waiting for its cue. Names were counted in breath. 1 tamp for a back taught to sing. 1 for a mouth denied sweet on a Sabbath. 1 for a boy marched at dusk along a road that learns to forget. The ladle rang the rim, a small iron bell with no congregation. The syrup skin tightened and said nothing. The firebox drew a thinner thread of flame and pretended obedience. Steam accepted what ink would refuse. Iron kept counsel because it had been treated kindly. The pan house did not change shape. It practiced the old sounds, draw, simmer, ring, and hid the new meaning in the space between them. Stillness grew thick enough to hold. Fire does not scream, it claims. The candle in the office bowed and held, as if it had seen something that knew how to be both mercy and sentence. The ground remembers. By morning, the pan house spoke its ordinary grammar again. Foam learned humility and cleared. Steam thinned to a shawl and slipped from the rafters. The horse took its circle with the patience of an old clock. The skimmer hung where it always hangs, a shadow shaped like work. Leaf skitter traced low sounds along the sill, though no wind signed the paper for it. Candle stubs at the office window stood like vertebrae of light, last night's spine left to cool. The key ring made a smaller circle on its nail than any man remembered. There is a silence that presses. It adds, it does not explain. Hands returned to the map they know. Wood set, damper checked, draw watched at the corner where syrup likes to argue. Beniah's steps counted themselves without being asked, from firebox to vat, lip to brace and back. Names repeated inwardly, matched to breath, matched to the little liturgies that keep a man whole when paper will not. The skimmer's nick was only a flaw again, not a letter. The hook was only a curve. The wedge was only wood that had learned posture. Dogs forgot the almost word they had nearly said. A boy peered in and learned nothing beyond what work teaches, that heat makes sweet behave if you know its manners. The air tasted of syrup and iron as it should. The vat kept its temperature like a story that declines to be retold. If anyone asked the floor what weight it carried, the boards would answer with old knots and new patience. The ground remembers. Chapter 10. The record turns away. Target, 300 words. Neighbors came with hats correct and phrases chosen. Fever, because fever is useful. Taint, because the word wears judgment like a ribbon. Providence, because providence never appears in court. The clerk in town set down wasting, as if mercy could be written with no hand attached. His pen hesitated above a line where wages had doubled for press days, and made a dot that bled into a blot. The blot grew until it looked like weather on paper, a storm no one could be blamed for. Safer to erase than to know. Rain practiced a careful hand on the courthouse roof, stitching slate to mourning in long gray seams. The bell learned a muffled voice, sorrow made polite. Rows of husks lay to dry beyond the panhouse, like a chapter spread open to forget its place. The ledger at the office learned to close early, leather speaking its little sermon on order. A quill lay quiet in its glass, with the look of innocence tools prefer. The overseer's cane reduced its maps on the floor, tracing borders inside borders, until geography itself seemed an apology. The big house windows wore a film that asked visitors to lower their questions. In the cabins, breath counted names without ink. No one mentioned the skimmer's nick. No one asked the wedge to explain its posture. The moral economy shifted its weight and pretended the chair had moved. Minutes in a book wrote everything that could not matter and nothing that could. The ground remembers where paper declines to stand. Chapter 11. The skimmer kept. Target, 300 words. Years pass as dust passes. Unnoticed, then suddenly the sun insists. A boy hunting string and nails near the sill found a bent pin with iron reddened by patience. The pin weighed like a small sentence completed. In the tool rack, a slotted skimmer kept its place, nick on the lip like a letter, as if someone had taught it to carry an alphabet no mouth should read. He traced the nick and felt the heat of a story that did not want his hand. In kitchens and yards, a rhyme persisted, stripped of meaning and stronger for it. Count the names, keep the heat. Children marched it around barrels and doors. Adults pretended not to hear and listened. At the county room, an archivist wrote "irregularity in pan house" in a margin. Then crossed the line once, then crossed the crossing, the paper wearing both scars like honesty that would not sit. Syrup-sweet dust lifted from a forgotten shelf when the door shut, making letters out of motes until the light moved and the alphabet fell apart. The skimmer hung. The hook waited. The wedge's scar in the brace seat learned to pass as age. A bent pin traveled a boy's pocket until it learned the shape of him, and then lived in a box with buttons and a marble. None of these could tell the story without becoming something else. Objects keep counsel when men decline to. The ground remembers. Chapter 12. Reckoning in the Pan House. Target, 375 words. Storms teach a building to breathe. The pan house takes in wind and lets it go through plank seams until the walls know their voices again. Hinges answer with a low vowel, iron's throat finding a note the day did not request. Sometimes the latch rises and settles without a hand, as if the room rehearses manners when it is sure no one will clap. The empty ladle on its hook looks like a question that has learned not to. Insist the floor keeps a damp line at the sill that darkens after rain and dries to a pale bone when the sun decides to bless. The names that matter travel there as weight, not letters. The ground remembers. Beniah is not in ink. Paper keeps what it is paid to keep. He is present in the path between firebox and vat, in the courtesy doors return when they have been respected, in the way a damper minds its position when asked in the right language. He is present in the hour when the mill slows and frogs remember to sing, in the skimmer's nick that refuses to polish out, in the wedge that sits more surely than it should. He is present in the breath between a boil learning discipline and a flame accepting instruction. It was not hope. Hope asks to be seen. Reckoning prefers to be believed. This was not revenge. Revenge is a show that wastes itself. This was reckoning. Counted, quiet, intimate as a hand on iron. The grammar of heat turned toward justice without spectacle. Order at table sharpened its blade. Order in steam taught the blade whose throat it served. Ledgers turned away. Minutes practiced amnesia. Rumor learned to sing in a child's meter so adults could stand to be near it. The room held the story without speaking. The fireboxes drew even. The pan returned to its steady breath. Fire does not scream, it claims. If someone stood at last light with the door cracked and the candle low, they might hear the ladle ring once, then fall still, and then nothing but the soft draw of the fire and a leaf skittering the floor into a single, whispered letter. They might feel the plank underfoot accept their weight and report it to the sill. They might think the steam wrote a word on the air and think better of it. The ground remembers. Walk with us into future investigations. One hinge, one ledger, one whisper at a time. If this stayed with you, please like so we know you felt it. Share this with someone who keeps careful truths so the ground remembers farther. Subscribe for careful archival episodes as they appear. Tap the bell to be notified. And in the comments, answer with just one word, counted or remembered.